We'll begin. Elder Ray Jones has agreed to open and begin with prayer, and then Trish Logan is going to present the paper.
Everybody, Ama Hiluch. That's good morning in Gitshan, Niska, and a bit of Chimshan there. So let's reflect a moment before I pray. We've get come to Gordon. Nine Ludats and Lacha. The awesome Ninil. Ama Hiluch, Kinaman Law. Egypt awesome the Dills, Kinaman Law. It could not as Nin Minum. Nin, the man can Gungan the Koimach. Mr. Mew, Mr. Lels, Skit Gorum. Ik gebied naar dem sexet, maar gaat dit en hem zegt zo al dit, wat zijn gesprek dit en zocht dit. De John kon nemen aan maar wen. Amen.
We asked Trish Logan, Dr. Trish Logan, to present the paper like 2 years ago. And then COVID hit. And so I reached out to her and she agreed to come and present. And I am so thankful that she did. She could probably give a better introduction of who she is and where she comes from than I can. Just take it away.
Good morning, Kanche Kiawao, Trisha Logan, Dishnikashoyen. I originally come from the Robinson Superior Treaty area of northwestern Ontario on the north shore of Lake Superior, where I grew up in Kakabeka Falls, outside of Thunder Bay. But I lived the last 20 years in Winnipeg, and now the last 3 years actually in Vancouver. And thank you everyone for welcoming me, and Kachin, Marcy, and Miigwech for the prayer this morning. And I've been a guest here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Musqueam since January 2019. And I'm very grateful for the warm welcome I've received, not only to this territory and as someone from the prairies and from the very flat, cold parts of Canada. I'm very grateful for also the body of knowledge that's here on this territory and all the teachings that I've received and all the warm lessons and talks and knowledge that my colleagues and my friends at Musqueam have been able to share in this time as me as a relative newcomer to the ocean, to living near the ocean. But I also acknowledge and thank all my elders in Winnipeg and around Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario, because that's where a lot of the teachings that I carry with me today come from my own family and from my family in the Qu'Appelle Valley. I'm Métis, and my family originally comes from Lebret, Saskatchewan, but my family also moved then later to Ontario. So as a Métis person, I have learned the Michif language and have worked with language revitalization programs, and I've been very lucky to keep up my language, or try to keep up my language, because I'm very much use it or lose it. And sometimes I've gone through big periods of time where I haven't been able to use it very often, but One good fortunate thing of pandemic times was Zoom lessons, and I was able to Zoom to Michif language lessons online and keep up with it. So that's something that means a lot to me, even though I'm not really a scholar or I'm not really always that great at language. I talk about it a lot because it means a lot to my connections to survivors and listening to stories of residential schools and listening to my own family's stories at residential school. My aunt just texted me before I came in. She saw a poem somewhere online, this old poem about fall leaves, that she remembers my grandmother. My grandmother attended the Capel Residential School in Lebret, Saskatchewan, and she remembers my grandmother reciting the poem. And she always loved poetry and little verses, and she would write out her recipes for me in little notebooks and always put little rhyming poems or little rhyming phrases or things she would have memorized, because they would memorize so many poems. So my aunt just sent me one just as I was coming in here, which made me think of my grandmother too. So I came to this work from Manitoba. I worked in 2000. I started on a project working with residential school survivors in Southwest Manitoba, in Brandon and Winnipeg, and mostly Métis people who attended. Because at that time, 22 years ago, very few people were talking about how Métis people attended, if Métis people attended at all. I had professors at the time when I was in university that said, well, no, Métis people didn't attend. It was only for First Nations kids. And I knew that wasn't the case. I knew that my family, by all political, economic, social, any kind of definition, were Métis people who did attend large residential schools in the prairies. So I knew that, and I had spoken to a number of different Métis community members. So I knew that wasn't true, even though there were very few records, there was very little historical evidence of it. And I had historians kind of shaking their head at me and thinking that I would never, that if it wasn't in the records and if it wasn't in the archive, that it just couldn't have been true. So that was the start of a lot of work of sitting down with survivors and listening to their stories. So a lot of what I talk about, and when I talk about histories and records, and now as someone who works at a university and kind of lives in an academic, a lot of the work I do is very academic, Western style academic. A lot of what I carry with me is stories from survivors, years of listening to oral histories and oral testimonies, stories, recordings in person. I went on to work with the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and the Legacy of Hope Foundation for several years. And part of that work was traveling across Canada to First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities in every part of Canada to record survivor stories. It was before the TRC, and it was a time when people were sharing their stories for a lot of different reasons, partly just to have their stories recorded at all, and to have their truths listened to, and to talk very specifically about very broad scope conversations about healing and about what needed to be remembered about the schools, even before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started its work. So I had this work with my colleagues, and I was taught by several different kinds of elders in different kinds of communities, and especially from survivors. I was taught how to listen, and not just kind of in a orality, oral history, storytelling way, but how to listen to trauma and how to listen to survivor stories and how to share that space with healers and traditional healers and medicine people and people who have traditionally been working with communities for their whole lives on how to kind of face those stories. So I think as much as I've learned the content and history and truths and context to all of those stories, I've also learned, I think even not even consciously, is how to also approach that trauma and approach those records respectfully, with ceremony, in prayer, and with respect, and the different kinds of stories. And that's what's really difficult sometimes in an academic setting or in a professional setting. I'm often called upon to talk to groups of professionals, to government employees, provincial, federal government employees, to churches, to schools, to teachers, to community groups, to hikers and Girl Guides, and all kinds of different groups want to learn about the truths of residential school, about the histories of Canada, about how the residential schools shaped Canada, how the national, like how Canada became a nation because residential schools forcibly removed children from their homes and forcibly relocated families, and the shape of what residential schools did to create Canada the way it is today. So often I'm asked to speak to all kinds of different groups at university and kindergarten level, all different ages and different kinds of groups of listeners. And I think those teachings of how to share truths and stories, as well as sharing traumatic histories. And it's really difficult sometimes because you're given sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, and to summarize these very complex, very traumatic, very personal, sometimes joyful, sometimes happy, sometimes hopeful, sometimes healing kinds of stories, and to do it in a very short amount of time. And because now the media and social media, and there's little snippets and bits and clips and very short little 94 calls to action to read, but there's so many stories, and there's so many, every story is so different, that we hear from survivors, and we honor how survivors tell those stories. And I think that was one lesson I learned early on, was repeatedly it was shared by survivors that while this is a story of just when I came into residential school and when I left, it was always in a bigger context. Those stories about people sharing memories of the time before they left, of before they went to school, of their parents and grandparents and their home memories, and then stories of what happened after they graduated or after they were discharged from the schools, when people had families of their own and worked, and all of the ongoing impacts on their home and their community. And that those stories were always in a bigger context. They were always in bigger context because over and over people said, you can't just listen to our stories and not also listen to our stories about land rights and about our languages and about the child welfare system and about health and about justice. And it really is about a bigger relationship with colonialism and Canada, and how to record those stories. So that's, as I carry that with me, I end up at universities and studying, researching how those histories do or don't fit into Canadian history, and how to confront the way Canadian history is written or contemporary Canadian narratives are written today. And something that came to me early on as well was the term genocide. And that was one of the names that was used quite often by survivors. And in the early 2000s, like 2002, 2003, 20 years ago, 20 years ago, at that time, survivors use that term quite often in a way, in a kind of a vocabulary and a way of describing what their experience was like of having all of their, especially entering schools, having all of their hair shaved off and given a number, and having their names taken away, and being loaded on train cars or loaded on buses or loaded on trucks and fed like animals and treated like animals. That kind of, the words they wanted to use and the words they did use were very much words that were words about genocide, or it was like a concentration camp. And it happened quite frequently. And early on, 20 years ago, in 2002, 2003, I asked for help. I asked for help because I, of course, had editors and people who wanted to kind of put everything into a report and write it up and said, well, we can't really use that word in Canada. That's a word people use in Australia or in the United States, but it's a word we don't really use in Canada, or we don't really use that in this context. So that's where I kind of tried to bridge teachings I got in First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities and teachings I was receiving from survivors, and tried to bridge that then in, went to do a master's degree and a PhD, and that was the topic I looked at, was how do we use the term genocide? What does it mean? And how does it work in Canada, in Canadian contexts? And what, if any way, can we also decolonize the way that genocide studies talks about colonial genocides? And that's where I came to kind of using the terms of settler colonialism and settler colonial genocide, because it's a bigger question. It's a bigger question of because people, media people especially, very quickly, very kind of curtly ask, they're like, well, we're residential schools of genocide. And I think from what I've learned and heard is it's a bigger context. It's because residential schools weren't isolated from a lot of other systems and structures of colonialism. They were inherently connected to Indian hospitals and day schools and the child welfare system and forcible relocations and the reserve system and the pass system and outlawing of ceremonies and the brutal abuses on language and culture. And as we heard after the Truth and Reconciliation about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and violence and these structures and systems that are all interconnected. They don't stand alone, and they're structures and systems that have gone on, carried on, and carry on today from 500 years ago. So it's talking about settler colonialism and genocide in a way that isn't one discrete kind of finite timed act, but it's something that carries on, and it's something that continues, and it's listening to elders and survivors, community leaders, to talk about from their perspective what genocide means, about what it means to totally eliminate culture and language and religion and economy and political and social structures inherently as a colonial structure. And as I learned more about genocide itself, how other genocides around the world also have this colonial element and forcibly removing people from their territories, forcibly removing children from one group to another, and what it means to dehumanize other people, and what that language and what those words mean. And in these contexts, what does starvation, killing of the buffalo, killing of animals, it's not just an individualistic violence or atrocity, it's very holistic. And today there's a lot of new scholarship. I'm interested in it. It's not my area of study just yet, but a lot of people looking at ecocide and climate displacement and migration as part of colonialism and colonial genocide. And so there's people looking at that right now, and what kind of a shape or a frame or the way that we name parts of history. And it keeps coming up. I teach a course in Indigenous governance and policy right now with the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And we were watching these films from the 1982 patriation of the Constitution and First Nations, Métis and Inuit leaders speaking in part of these NFB documentaries. And the term genocide comes up repeatedly from the speakers and the people presenting to the constitutional talks that came after 1982. And it's kind of a governance frame and talking about atrocity and talking about Canada. It was a term that came up quite often, and I may have watched that 20 years ago and not really picked up on it. But of course now have kind of changed the way I've thought about it. And it comes up, I'm speaking later in a class about literature, about writing and literature, and I'm also not a really good scholar in creative writing or literature, even though I read a lot of poems and use literature quite often, because I think for all of the pushback and denial and rhetoric, because that's a lot of people's reaction to using the term, to using words like genocide or colonial genocide, is they think that it kind of elicits too strong of a reaction, that people will automatically deny. They're like, no, 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 that's a crime in the international court, and that's a legal term, and by the legal definition, it doesn't fit the legal model, even though it is also, it's used outside of a legal frame. A lot of people kind of hesitate to use it, use the term cultural genocide or use different terms. And kind of there's this reaction, and there's always this pushback about talking about residential schools at all. And I didn't think, it's always happened. It's always happened because it's the work that I work most closely with is histories of residential schools and stories from survivors of residential school. And it's always happened where people have diminished or denied what happened or questioned it, or in a very kind of hateful way sometimes. It's always happened, but I didn't imagine, perhaps naively, just to what extent I would have to use history and archival documents and recorded oral histories as evidence to respond to people who were completely denying that any of it happened at all. And I think, I'm sure it comes up quite often, where the unmarked burial sites and the cemeteries and all of the locations where there's currently investigations going on have kind of reignited these conversations, and people asking the same questions, people giving the same kind of pushback or kind of resistance. And resistance is kind of a nice word for some of the responses. But there's also often surprise. People say, all the time, people said, I grew up in this community, I grew up in these towns, and there was a school right across from me, and I had no idea what was happening. I had no one talked about it. No one listened to us. We had no idea. And it's often in literature and in stories, and I said that's often where those stories ended up, is that while there were not really historians ready to write those histories in the mid 60s or the 70s, there were memoirs and poems and songs and literature where survivors of residential school were writing their stories, were telling their stories, were sharing them, but we're also creating visual art and finding spaces that were kind of literary journals or smaller newsletters to tell their stories, share their stories. And so there's all these collections from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and books, published books, unpublished books, where the stories were always there. But I think that's always the kind of confronting how the record is, and where those stories meet the record is to kind of confront people to say the stories were always there. The stories were always there, and it was whether or not people were willing to hear it. Because there is inherently a lot of difficult truths that come up. And it's asking people to continually share traumatic histories over and over. And it's interesting also to listen to why people choose to tell their stories, because a lot of people, as part of their story, share why they are willing to share it, and why also people often ask if I get tired or if it's hard for me to share those stories. But if for the number of times that I've been told, like, people have shared their stories and they want to tell their story once and they want to have it recorded once and they don't want to talk about it again. And for a number of people, recognize that there's a role for people to record histories, to create archival collections, to create written collections, and just to keep it, and that act of listening and those teachings about listening and how you carry that with you in your heart and in your mind, aside from what's written or what's recorded or what's on my computer, how to carry those stories with you and how to share them, um, is this kind of sacred trust. And listening to, as people are sharing that, those sacred trusts, those truths, why they chose to tell it at all. Because there's countless people who choose not to tell those stories. And so it's in all of those, recognizing that as well, that people speak for people who aren't able to speak. That's what made me think of my aunt sending me this poem this morning. This poem, it was about autumn leaves. It was about fall leaves falling. And I was like, that's kind of the stories that my grandmother talked about, was about poems and about funny things that the nuns did, and about doing the walk, the Stations of the Cross up the hill, and it being very hot in the summer. A few stories to remember, but obviously was very selective of what she talked about. And people do that to protect themselves and to think about their own healing and their own trauma in their own way. And I think that's, in a way, also how I came to language or to any kinds of teachings, because it inherently, those teachings come together with life teachings, leadership, and lessons about laughter and resistance and resilience and activism. And for I was often asked about apology and the Pope's apology and apology in Canada, and how the Prime Minister had apologized in 2008 and how the Pope apologized more recently this summer. And the term, like the conversations about apology come up quite often. And I was reminded by several survivors and leaders that, especially in 2008, where now I always kind of pick at it a little bit as a historian and as a picky academic, where the language is kind of like Stephen Harper presented an apology in 2008, or it kind of comes as an act of altruism. That the way it's worded sometimes is that Stephen Harper, as Prime Minister, woke up one morning and thought, I should really apologize for that. And forgetting the years and decades of advocacy and activism and storytelling and negotiations down to the last minute of, that was survivors meeting at their kitchen tables, in band halls, in community centers, telling their stories and talking about the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, talking about creating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and talking about how important it would be for Canada or either church, Protestant churches or the Catholic Church, to present an apology. And so after years of, which was activism, which was letters to members of parliament, letters to church officials, letters to the Pope, letters to the Crown, letters to the Queen, on how important an apology means. And it's a mixed emotion, because some people still see it and will always see it as that it is presented as words on a page. It's presented and it's really meaningless without action. But for a lot of people, no matter what the word said or who was presenting it, and not everyone was a huge fan of Stephen Harper as Prime Minister, no matter who was presenting it, just to have their stories acknowledged and have their stories heard was such a significant act, that even if no one was, not everyone was super happy with the way it was worded or the way it was presented or the way the narrative was presented, that having their story, that someone heard their stories, someone heard their truth and responded to it and apologized for it, and that people had the opportunity to forgive or to forgive on their own time and on their own terms, was significant for so many, that they had this truth that they carried with them their whole lives was being heard on a bigger stage. So I think that's also, I think there's, and I work in a way that I often work with provincial governments and federal governments, and have a healthy level of cynicism about provincial governments and federal governments, and how the Crown and Indigenous relations plays out in Canada. And so while I'm not always a huge, you know, I have a healthy level of cynicism, but I look at things like the report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the final report, and the calls to action, and things that people are often very critical of. And with the Day of Truth and Reconciliation coming up next week, the question comes quite often is, what's happening? Is anyone addressing it? Is anything changing? Is there anything, did anything even happen? And it's looking at like the 94 calls to action that are presented in English and French as kind of a gov doc, to some very kind of a cold style of a government document that's run by the government. But really, if, you know, I do have a lot of, perhaps it's from my own knowledge, but I do know how much those do reflect. To me, there is a genuine reflection on the way that survivors told their stories, in the way that the calls to action and the way that those reports did come out, because the fact that child welfare and language and health and education were at the very top of the list, I'm certain is about the way that survivors told their stories, about that it's 94 different things that extend those stories, that it isn't just about what happened at residential school, and it's beyond a conversation of the naming of calling it genocide or not calling it genocide or cultural genocide. It's about a much bigger picture about human rights and social justice and peace and peacemaking, and not in peace as in an absence of war, but in communities, any communities where there's violence and ongoing violence and oppression, that isn't peace. So it's kind of framing those calls to action and framing reconciliation from that view, that it is a much bigger, a much broader conversation, and it's a much more contextualized conversation in the way that survivors are telling their stories. And if we're able to hear it, and again, it's something that's often asked, you know, I'm asked in a 30-second, you know, seminal phone from media, or a student will ask in a class, and you have to kind of summarize all of this history and all of these stories and all of these legacies of colonialism in 30 seconds or a minute. And there's so much that is missed, and there's so many conversations that are so important. So and people often ask, that's the question people ask, is what can I do? As an organization, as a school or a government or a church, what can we do? And it's, and I never have a quick, fast, short, brief answer, because I put that back on people who ask, is what can people offer? It's often teachers because teachers see what's in the curriculum, they see what they can do in their classrooms, but they want to know what they can do when they go home, when they talk to their kids, when they meet their families, when they're in the community. What can they do to confront denial, to confront racism, to just even have a conversation at all? And so everyone has, and again, something that I've been taught over many years is everyone has gifts. Everyone has a strength and a gift. Some people are artists, some people are extroverted and speak in front of people, some people are very quiet. Everyone has a gift with them. And so there's something, because there's so many complexities and there's so much to all of these histories of residential schools and stories and reconciliation. There's so many parts of it. There's something that connects with everybody. Some people connect to language, some people connect to education, some people connect to museums or or reading or narratives, and everyone has something that they connect to. So that's often what I share. And so I think that's the prevailing thing that I've learned, and I'm still learning today, is no matter what the naming and the framing is, that it's trying to, as best I can, convey all of those different kinds of stories, because there's so many different ways that stories of residential school and these conversations about reconciliation and how they fit, how many different ways that they're talked about and learned, and how that then shapes how we talk about it in Canada. Yeah, I'm mindful of the time. I don't know if I'll, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. I raised my children in Regina, Saskatchewan, and I knew folks, next door neighbors from the Métis. There's Gabriel Dumont Housing was in Regina. I was living in Silver Sage Housing. First Nations housing. It was good that you reminded us that many Métis people ended up in the residential school. And then there was the added insult of some folks. I appreciate the way that you talked about how hard it is to, but important that the stories are extended. I particularly appreciated that the 95 was really not just a government document, but trying to extend the stories and try to truly move forward to make peace. I think the schedule says we're gonna stand up and take a short break, doesn't it? Yes. And then, but not very long, so. And then we have another paper. It's not coffee time yet.
So I'm Lina Skum from Norway, from Sápmi and from our land we greet you all, and I'm happy to be able to introduce some of the researchers in our trading or Recontrans research project. There are several good people who will take the floor today, and I'm happy to introduce some of them. The first one now will be Dr. Demain Solomons from University of Western Cape of South Africa. I would like to also take the opportunity to thank Demain. He was a part of the editorial group for our first publication on trading justice for peace, reframing reconciliation in TRC processes in South Africa, Canada, and Nordic countries. So thank you for that. So I give the floor to Demain. Reconciliation as performance, a critical appraisal of the TRC hearings in South Africa.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lina. And good morning, everyone. Let me start off by acknowledging that I am a guest, a South African, here on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. With this, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak, and also thank you for your hospitality. It's very good being here. Chief Ray, I think I'm like you, I'm also a paper guy. If it's not on paper, it doesn't exist, at least in my mind. So thank you. The paper that I want to share with you, or the work that I want to share with you today is, reconciliation as performance. And it's a focus on the South African context. Of course, South Africa, Canada, Norway, three very different contexts, but there are points of convergence. Of course, there are also points where these contexts differ quite considerably. But I think there are many overlaps, which I think is quite helpful in the various contexts. Yes, we have seen and heard it all before. In fact, some of us have grown tired of debates over the promise of reconciliation, despite being reminded that it is fundamental to developing a just society. This makes it difficult to agree what reconciliation means, how it works, and of course, why it is essential. If things go our way, we think of it as our most prized idea, but in times of distress, cheap deception. Now, behind such contestation is a longing for, at least in my case, for a South Africa or perhaps a Canada that does not exist, a disparity between what is and what ought to be in a country riddled with contradictions and obscurities. This is an absurd state of affairs arising from a system premised on the fundamental irreconcilability of people. Now, the quest for reconciliation emerges from the tension between our desire for order, meaning, and contentment on the one hand, and an indifferent world unwilling to provide that on the other. In this sense, reconciliation and its connection with philosophical absurdism could not be more apt. This is what the French philosopher Albert Camus wrestled with in his famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. For Camus, the absurd encapsulates the human propensity to seek inherent value and meaning in the context of a chaotic, irrational, and sometimes meaningless world. He compares the absurdity of life with the situation of Sisyphus, a figure in Greek mythology who is condemned to repeat the same arduous task of pushing a boulder up a mountain only to see it roll down again once the summit is reached. Now, this sequence or metaphorical loop is repeated into the realms of eternity. Driven by the desire for meaning amid meaninglessness, South Africans embarked on a journey of reconciliation. I would say, in some cases, a romantic pursuit for a new way of being in the aftermath of the absurdity of the racism and its association with apartheid. It was an audacious plan, no doubt, setting in motion a chain of events that culminated in what became the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a process for better or worse that etched the dream of reconciliation in the hearts and minds of people. At the center of the TRC stood Archbishop Desmond Tutu, its charismatic chairperson, affectionately known as the Arch. Tutu and his colleagues were tasked to breathe life into one of the most contested terms in the struggle against the racism of apartheid. Not only was the notion and practice of reconciliation tied up with ideological conflict, but doubts concerning its potential to transform society was an ever-present reality. That being the case, equating this endeavor to the taking up of a poisoned chalice would not be an overstatement. Notably, reconciliation and its contestation cannot be separated from the influence of Christianity in South Africa. And I sense there's a similar thing happening in a place like Canada. Moreover, the centrality of reconciliation in Christian soteriology and its significance of what is aptly described as the church struggle against apartheid. Reconciliation was at the very center of the struggle, challenging both the politics and theology of racial separation. This is evident in the message to the people of South Africa in 1968, the South African Leadership Assembly, the Bella Confession, the National Initiative for Reconciliation, and lastly, also the Rustenburg Declaration. However, the term elicited much controversy in the Kairos document that was published in 1985, where the emphasis on reconciliation was severely criticized as a form of church theology, a theology of reconciliation considered cheap or inauthentic. Irrespective of its impact on the apartheid establishment, people like Desmond Tutu did not, or at least declined to sign the Kairos document or to endorse the Kairos document. This is due to his displeasure in how church theology and reconciliation were caricatured and criticized, whether by those in defense of their supposed neutrality or those who rejected it as counterproductive to the liberation struggle. In retrospect, Tutu's conception of reconciliation was bound to be at odds with popular ideas at the time, whether by those who supported or those who rejected apartheid or racism, remembering that the need for reconciliation appears in the face of violence, rendering its quest hostile to itself. In such instances as with the Kairos document and later with the TRC, a pattern of binary thinking emerges where dilemmas are often oversimplified to arrive at convenient answers, rendering nuances less than obvious. Now, the trouble with this form of binary thinking is that we tend to emphasize the things we agree with and avoid those things that contradict our position. Elsewhere, I categorize such quandaries, including the quest for reconciliation, as a wicked problem, since many of the variables associated with the concept are often ignored for ideological alignment. In this context, it might be worthwhile exploring the nuances of Tutu's position. In recognizing complexity, how does one augment Tutu's theology of reconciliation? Of course, his leadership was crucial. If Kairos and the TRC as used as a point of reference, many seem to misinterpret or simply do not appreciate exactly what is at stake. As someone who devoted much attention to the development of Black theology or liberation theologies in South Africa, Tutu's methodology is premised on an irreducible drive towards the liberation of the oppressed. This reveals an approach that is both uncompromising and humane, keeping in mind that this is much more than a political quest. Closer investigation reveals a theology of reconciliation that proceeds from a state of kenosis, a word derived from the Greek word kino, found in Philippians 2. The meaning of kenosis is to empty, describing God's act of self-emptying through the incarnation. More broadly, the Christian doctrine of incarnation speaks to the very specific act of God's interaction with the world through Christ. With this at the forefront of our thinking, the kenosis of God in Christ becomes the ethical or philosophical mode through which Christian leadership is, or at least should be, expressed. Adequately understood, kenosis requires one to transcend narrow self-interest to locate the other in the mutuality of love. This leads one to locate the other in their mutual humanity, a communal redefinition of what it means to be human, founded on self-sacrificial love. Building on the doctrinal tenets of the incarnation, The understanding of kenosis becomes the foundation on which Tutu's Ubuntu theology is based. In turn, this Ubuntu theology became the lens through which he engaged the very notion of reconciliation. Now, the connection between Ubuntu and reconciliation is one of the hallmarks of Tutu's approach. This was in sharp contrast to the logic of apartheid and racism, turning the assumption of the fundamental irreconcilability of people on its head. Instead, the restoration of friendship and the realization of the need to make amends for wrongs committed took center stage. Flowing from this, reconciliation becomes the pivot, a kenotic form of love that acknowledges the unity and diversity of peoples and their interdependence, irrespective of the social markers that separate them. God's act of self-emptying, an undeserved act of love, becomes the basis on which the liberation and reconciliation of Black and white compatriots are established. In accepting the social and cultural locality, reconciliation's potential is given new meaning through Ubuntu, a philosophy of love that transcends individual autonomy and narrow self-interest. Now, to understand what reconciliation meant during the TRC, one should not only distinguish the variety of narratives covered by the word reconciliation, but also become aware of the event character of the concept at the TRC. In its report, the Commission described the event character, which was mediated through Christian liturgical elements. And I quote, all the hearings were to have a ceremonial aspect. The chairperson's opening remarks were often preceded by prayer, by the lighting of a memorial candle, by hymns or songs. When Archbishop Tutu presided, he wore his purple robes, lending his own special presence to the occasion. This religious aspect of the hearings was sometimes criticized, especially for its mainly Christian focus. It became clear, however, that this was not inappropriate in a country where a considerable majority of the population is Christian. In later hearings, when Archbishop Tutu himself was not present, other religious leaders were often asked to pray. Often as well, local community groups would introduce songs and ceremony. Ibrahim Musa captured the role of religion in the TRC well when he describes the TRC as a performance. More importantly, it played a cathartic role for most of the time in the life of the newborn nation. In this respect, it must be viewed as an event that prefigures other momentous events. Any event of this magnitude is actually a performance. A performance is when the actors have already configured the purpose of the play, and there is hope that other participants and viewers will also understand this message. World history, especially sacred history, has a long record of narratives of performance. The Genesis story, Abraham's sacrifice of his son, and the crucifixion of Jesus. It is as performance that the TRC event has greater value as symbol, myth, and spectacle. Musa further compares it to the way redemption is embodied in the Eucharist. The performance of the TRC event resonates as a redemption of the sins of apartheid racism. The suffering and oppression experienced by the disenfranchised was dramatized or performed twice in the lives of many people. The first was at the instance of the injury itself, whether it is that of the victims or the trauma of their dependents. The second dramatization was in the theater of the TRC event itself, where these sins were replayed to the benefit of a variety of hosts, commissioners, the media observers, the aggrieved, the archivists, the psychologists, and the politicians, to mention but a few. In what way did the TRC turn the suffering of the heroes of liberation into a gift of sacrifice for the new South Africa? In some way, the sacrifice can be justified as a necessity. Without this sacrifice, as well as in some way, this sacrifice can be justified as a necessity. Without sacrifice, as well as considering the impossibility of justice that prefigured it, the discourse of reconciliation may not have been possible. At the same time, one must bear in mind that the total and absolute reconciliation cannot be realized. For this reason, reconciliation was the most viable solution in a context that was riddled with incompleteness, incoherence, and the coexistence of opposites. The TRC can indeed be placed within an established South African tradition of symbolic and the spectacular, with a dramatic impact on the public sphere and media, giving attention to the individual case, lacking time and focus on the social process of change. Tutu also reflected on his own experience as chairperson of the TRC, noting, very few people objected to the heavy spiritual and indeed Christian emphasis of the commission. When I was challenged, Tutu says, by journalists, I told them I was a religious leader and had been chosen as who I was. I could not pretend to be someone else. I operated as who I am, and I was accepted by the commission. It meant that theological and religious insights and perspectives would inform much of what we did and how we did it. We were only too happy to be guided where it was appropriate by the healthcare providers on the commission, be it psychologists, medical doctors, nurses, who made very significant contribution to the evolution of the policies on reparation and rehabilitation that we eventually presented as our recommendations to the president. Equally, we made good use of theological verities which were applicable to our work. He also reminds us that the contribution to Christian theology, the contribution that Christian theology made to the TRC in terms of making a distinction between a perpetrator as a sinner who is called to repent and a monster, and thus so in terms of recognition of the moral universe in which good and evil matter. It leads him as a Christian to the conclusion that there is no future without forgiveness. This overview of interpretations of the concept of reconciliation at the TRC by commissioners, social scientists, and theologians confirm that a permanent tension existed between various understandings of reconciliation at the TRC. According to Shaw, the main fault lines was between a political interpretation focusing on national reconciliation and a moral or religious approach that focused on individual and interpersonal reconciliation. This is confirmed in the already quoted book 1 of the TRC report, the potentially dangerous confusion between a religious, indeed Christian, understanding of reconciliation, more typically applied to interpersonal relationships, and the more limited political notion of reconciliation applicable to a democratic society. The reference to potential dangerous confusion expresses the sentiments of modern liberal societies, which distinguishes between public and private according to the line political, religious, but which does not mirror the traditional South African understanding of the politics and reconciliation, which I think is the case in the Canadian context as well. That religion, especially Christianity, could be so influential in the TRC and proved to be a rich example of religious conflict resolution, is directly related to the fact that by and large, the TRC was able to maintain the late modern tension between liberal political convictions and religious worldviews. Now, unsurprisingly, the vision of the so-called rainbow people of God might be easier said than done. Some arguing that people like Desmond Tutu and indeed people like Nelson Mandela simply set the bar too high by ascribing a theological as opposed to a political understanding of reconciliation's potential. Along with this, cautionary remarks were issued not to misrepresent the South African project as a search for spiritual reconciliation, but instead appreciate it as a secular pact or a political agreement. For example, Jake Scherwel, who was the president of my university, argued that the spiritualization of reconciliation poses the risk of pathologizing a nation which is in relatively good health by insisting on the perpetual quest for the holy grail of reconciliation. Further maintaining that the framing of reconciliation in this context of love and forgiveness takes us back to primitive notions not suitable for modern societies, and that the mechanisms of solidarity of contemporary South Africa are no longer love for neighbor, but rather commitment to consensus seeking, cultivating of conventions of civility and respect for contracts. In this sense, some very prominent South Africans were quite adamant in their terms not to confuse politics with theology, especially as far as determining the contours of reconciliation in the country concerned. Now, nearing 3 decades after the TRC in South Africa first started its work, the quest for reconciliation remains as elusive as ever. Along with apartheid, the democratic dispensation has brought with it many new challenges. Today, discourses on reconciliation have become rather esoteric, a symptom of more pressing concerns plaguing the country, coming to terms with a history of injustice. If reconciliation took center stage during our transitional phase, today the notion has lost its premier status as a guiding vision for social transformation in the country. Along with this, the legacy of people like Desmond Tutu, along with Nelson Mandela, is being contested more than ever before. This is prompted by views that under their leadership, the overemphasis on reconciliation did very little to disrupt the socio-economic vestiges of apartheid. Here, reconciliation without addressing the root causes of injustice is often cited as a concern. This skepticism is best expressed in the tension between the work of the TRC and the reality that South Africa remaining one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal country in the world as far as income inequality is concerned. This is hardly surprising given the social definitions marked especially by race, class, gender, and ethnicity, among other things. Under these circumstances, one would have to once again reconsider whether indeed reconciliation has the potential to transform society. Since it is something that constantly needs clarification, it often loses its power as a symbol. Properly understood, a symbol is something that is self-evident. It needs no explanation. It grips the imagination, prompting the need for some to invoke an expression of reconciliation that is considered true or authentic. If anything, the question whether reconciliation has the role to play or has a role to play in addressing some of our most difficult challenges would undoubtedly have to be addressed. The view that under current circumstances, it lacks the gravity to do just that might very well be dependent on a political as opposed to a theological understanding of its potential. Now, the arduousness of the pursuit of reconciliation or the reconciliation ideal continues to baffle those looking for quick answers to a complex, wicked problem. In this sense, I maintain that the quest for reconciliation has in some ways become an exercise in the absurd, since there is no rational or succinct way of capturing exactly what is at stake. While there may well be consensus on what reconciliation entails, controversies over how this ideal is to be realized suggest conflicting interpretations of its value and meaning. It is something that transcends our ability or urge for mastery and is therefore best described as an elusive mystery, a dream that cannot be fathomed or achieved. This is amid our propensity to forever search for meaning, irrespective of the incongruity of the ideal and the absurdity that defines our chaotic, irrational, and sometimes meaningless existence. The TRC, as flawed as it might have been, is the audacity to dream of something beyond meaninglessness, the meaninglessness that sometimes defines our existence. Moreover, invoking a theology of reconciliation to achieve something extraordinary, resisting the temptation of utter hopelessness. In this context, Camus' conception of the absurd provides a glimmer of hope. It is a stark reminder that our efforts may very well be futile, but that we should endure nevertheless. We, like Sisyphus, are charged to roll a boulder up a mountain only to see it roll down over and over again. As we reflect on truth and reconciliation commissions in Canada, Norway, and my own country, South Africa, we are encouraged to continue striving for this ideal. Like Sisyphus, we should cope as best we can with whatever challenges come our way, embracing the absurd background of our existence. In the words of Camus, and I quote, each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This is a constant reminder of why, for us, some difficulties at least are worth enduring in a world that is as precarious and as unsettling as ours. This diagnosis is not a fatality. The absurdity of the situation is our reality, but it is love that saves us from it. The paradoxical presence of meaning amid meaninglessness. Perhaps this is the one thing we should learn from truth and reconciliation commissions, prompting the question not who is my neighbor, but rather how can I be a neighbor? The ultimate expression of love for God's creation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Domain, for your presentation. I noticed you used the word cheap reconciliation connected to the Kairos process, Kairos document, and somehow that resonates because in Norway we are in the middle of this process with the TRC Commission, and there is a fear also that reconciliation can be cheap if it's not true, if it's not authentic, and if it's not transformative. So thanks for that reminder. We will move on to the next presentation. It will be my colleague, Tor Jonsson. He's a Sami theologian and associate professor at Vid Specialized University. And he will speak about small stories challenging large narratives, concerns expressed at public TRC meetings in Norway.
Good. We have a PowerPoint. Just for your information, there will be two switches that are. Do you have the manuscript? Okay, good. Good morning, everybody. It is with humility being here on the indigenous lands of the Musqueam, having listened to the powerful and painful stories yesterday, to share the experience from my part of the world. I'm very happy for Tricia's presentation this morning, also because I think it somehow builds a bridge from what we heard yesterday towards my approach to small stories challenging large narratives. You spoke about the larger context, and also that the calls for action as an extension of the small stories or the stories shared. And this is my entrance point, so to say, of what I want to say. In this paper, I want to highlight the significance of personal accounts given at public TRC meetings in Norway, seeing them as small stories challenging large narratives. And I will, to begin with, just give you a short introduction to the Norwegian TRC and some background about the Norwegianization policy. Then I will introduce theoretical perspectives engaged with and framing my approach before presenting my emerging analysis of these personal accounts. And in the end, I want to give a few observations regarding aspects of reconciliation reflected in these personal accounts. So the next image. Since fall 2018, a parliamentary TRC has operated in Norway. Its full name is the Commission Investigating the Norwegianization Policy and Injustice Against the Sami and Kvenes/Norwegian Finns, and its short name is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This TRC, submitting its final report on June the 1st next year, is mandated with 3 tasks. First, to map the policy and activities of the Norwegian authorities towards the Sami and Kvenes/Norwegian Finns from year 1800 onwards. Second, to investigate the effects and consequences of the Norwegianization policy up to present day. And third, to propose measures contributing to further reconciliation. The Norwegianization policy refers to an official Norwegian assimilation policy, having its beginnings around 1850, explicitly targeting the 2 minorities, namely the indigenous Sami and the national minority called Kvenes or Norwegian Finns. While both are associated with northern parts of Norway, the traditional territory of the Sami encompasses also large parts of mid-Norway. Informed by Norwegian nationalism, racist assumptions as social Darwinism and other things, and security policy, the Norwegianization policy promoted a narrative about Norway as a monocultural and monoethnic nation. Its most powerful implementation occurred from around 1900 when Among other things, also residential schools were introduced. The gradual dismantling of this policy took place from approximately 1950 to 1980. However, in the early or mid 2010s, a growing feeling that the Norwegianization is an ongoing reality gave rise to demands for a truth commission, first among the Sami and then the Kvenes joined in. One note that the TRC, after its establishment, has chosen to include also a third group affected by the Norwegianization policy, namely a national minority called Forest Finns, associated with southeastern parts of Norway. In what follows, I will concentrate on the Sami and Kvenes, and there are almost no Forest Finn voices in the public meetings either, as far as I've seen. Okay, the theoretical approach. The title of this paper, Small Stories Challenging Large Narratives, foregrounds a basic perspective informing my analysis. By large narratives, I mean dominant narratives about Norway as a nation, shaping the circumstances under which indigenous and national minorities in Norway live. This resonates with Romero Amaya's critical discussion of historical narratives in post-conflict societies, acknowledging that injustices are neither self-explanatory nor standing alone. Romero Amaya draws attention to how historical narratives set the moral compass and the explanatory framework of the conflict. Historical narratives are thus not innocent, but rather, in the words of Romero Amaya, functioning as, quote, memory frameworks, connecting the past, present, and future to sustain political agendas, end quote. In this context, Romero Amaya discusses how two types of historical narratives, namely what she calls narratives of nationhood and narratives of silence, serve to justify a mass injustice. In Norway, such large narratives are now being challenged by what I call small stories. That is, personal stories being told to the TRC by Sami, Kven, and Forest Finn individuals. Until now, such stories have reached the Norwegian majority public to a very limited extent. They have basically stayed within the private and social spheres of the minorities or simply remained untold. Therefore, when people now choose to tell such small stories at a radically different stage, namely to a TRC authorized by the Norwegian Parliament, then the agency involved in this should be acknowledged. Applying Romero Amaya's third and last type of historical narratives, namely narratives of resistance, may thus be applied on these small stories. They can be, at least in part, be read as narratives of resistance. Recognizing this element of these stories is probably important to counteract a negative stereotype at times held up against indigenous and national minorities in Norway, namely the accusation that they are cultivating a victim role and only sharing histories of suffering. I argue that this perception is reflecting of a dominant narrative preventing people to see and acknowledge the political and moral discourse Sami, Kven, and Norwegian Finn individuals now are engaging in. Choosing to tell your personal story to a parliamentary TRC investigating the Norwegianization policy and injustice against your people, suggests that a considerable component of historical and political agency is involved. John Clausen provides further theoretical depth to my approach in the ways he uses narrative methodology to explain the contributions of individual stories in the South African TRC. Mindful of the asymmetrical power relations between individual stories and dominant meta-narratives, Clausen suggests that inviting stories of ordinary people into TRC hearings made a hole in the fence surrounding the privileged space in which the national narrative has been defined. Here, the significance of personal stories is not merely about whose truth is being told, Clausen notes. Personal stories additionally convey a different kind of truth, namely moral truth, that demands an ethical response from society. Moreover, beyond conveying mere information about events and life conditions, personal stories are powerful because they provide interpretation, and they provide criteria for interpretation, not least in the ways the past and the present is seen as interconnected, and the past and the future. Material and my analysis method. In Norway, public TRC meetings have been, the TRC meetings in Norway have been staged somewhat differently than what you have experienced in Canada and in South Africa. They have been staged as a hybrid between information meetings from the information from the TRC and providing some space for people to start sharing their concerns and experiences. And a strategy has been that the vulnerable stories are rather told in interviews. So this may explain why there are not very many residential school survivor stories among the stories at open meetings. I have observed 16 of 26 physical public TRC meetings from 2019 to 2021. I've only observed 4 of them physically, but this has been complemented with the 15 fully recorded meetings made available on YouTube. All meetings are transcribed and personal accounts are being labeled and interpreted in line with qualitative data analysis method of thematic analysis. As for now, I have fully labeled 5 to 6 meetings. So this also implies that the findings and interpretations I'm presenting now are preliminary, emerging, somehow also impressions, and so this may change and will develop. I have so far identified 7 types of narratives, each reflecting a particular set of positions, motives, concerns, and relations. While some of these types overlap considerably, others do not. The latter foregrounds relevant differences across the accounts recorded. Due to limited time, I focus only on the 5 most dominant narratives, of which 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 tend to align. We are very good cooperation. Thank you for on the PowerPoint. Impressive. The narratives of revitalization which are reflected in a large number of accounts, evolve around issues of language and culture. This narrative has a quite strong collective component and often linked up with organizational efforts. Regarding the distribution, this narrative type is widespread among both Sami and Kven accounts, with the difference that it emerges as the dominant narrative among the Kvens. A difference in terms of emphasis seems to be that while the challenge to the Sami emerges primarily as the problem of an implementation gap or a lacking correspondence with adopted rights, the basic Kven problem is framed more as insufficient or lacking recognition. And this aligns somehow with the problem of invisibility, which is the fourth narrative. The narratives of invisibility and non-recognition, which also occur in a considerable number of accounts, have a large overlap with the narrative of revitalization. They are found among both Sami and Kven voices, but again, it is more dominant among the Kvens. This picture is, by the way, supported by a very recent public survey published less than a month ago, conducted by the Norwegian Institute of Human Rights, suggesting that while the Norwegian majority population has poor knowledge about both groups, it is extraordinarily low with respect to the Kvens. The fifth narrative is type, which I call narratives of land, livelihoods, and conflict, is found only in the Sami accounts, where it emerges rather often. The topics tending to interlink here concern reindeer herding and other traditional land uses, windmill plants and extractive industries, court cases, national politics, large corporations and indigenous rights, and also the matter of green colonization. The dynamic reflected in these accounts is illustrative of Lightfoot's hard rights, soft rights distinction, reflecting the observation that settler states are far more resistant to the hard indigenous rights to land and self-determination than to the soft indigenous rights to culture, language, education, etc. And these narratives tend to align with the next type, which I have called narratives on hate speech and visibility. These narratives are found again only among the Sami voices, as far as I can see, while obviously informing the dynamics surrounding the narratives of land, livelihoods, and conflict, at least to some extent. This sixth narrative applies also more broadly among the Sami, are affected in various ways. It is particularly associated with media, for instance, comment boxes and social media, but may also apply to other public spaces, for instance, stories from soccer games, for instance. Indigenous rights and the status of the Sami as an indigenous people seem to be a key trigger for the problem, for this problem in the contemporary context. And this seemed to align with a finding in the above-mentioned population survey conducted by the Norwegian Institute for Human Rights, suggesting that a large minority in the Norwegian population, especially in the north, dispute the status of the Sami as an indigenous people. Relevant to note, a recent governmental report published during summer from the Commission on Freedom of Expression points out that hate speech and discriminatory speech directed at the Sami make many Sami hesitant in engaging in public debates. It is fair to regard this problem or the problem discussed under this heading as a contemporary reverberation of a race-based historical narrative in Norway, describing the Sami as a primitive race, and also a strong component of race biology in the history. The seventh narrative, type of narrative, I call narratives of healing. These narratives, which are also quite many, address concerns as shame, taboos, breaking the silence, and in-group and intra-group tensions. This type of narratives may be divided into subtypes in terms of topics addressed, as sexual violence and intergenerational trauma, the call for Sami diversity and being good enough, reflective of how people now are positioned very different in terms of their identities. The related issue of multiple identities, example given Kven and Sami, or Sami and Norwegian, and overcoming oppositional identities, questions about religion and traditional spirituality, or overcoming Church of Norway's lacking recognition of the Kvens, for instance. So this brief overview suggests that by identifying categories, mapping linkages within and across the individual accounts, one can start to account for emerging patterns in order to develop interpretations and potential or suggestive explanations. Explicit references to reconciliation, and this is the conclusion part, are rarely found in the personal accounts. However, implicit aspects of reconciliation are evident. Having mapped this according to two parameters, I will, as a conclusion, point out a few preliminary impressions. First, I have mapped emphasis across the somewhat overlapping categories of political reconciliation, social reconciliation, and healing. And the distinction between political and social reconciliation I borrow from De Grocchi, who uses political reconciliation about reconciliation processes relating to the authorities, and social reconciliation about intergroup reconciliation primarily on a local level. While these three categories may intertwine, and they do, my impression is that political reconciliation is the most emphasized in the personal accounts, while social reconciliation comes second and healing third. And this observation strengthens the claim argued for in the beginning, namely that personal accounts given at public TRC meetings in Norway engage in a type of political discourse. Second, I have mapped emphasis among the categories of truth, justice, repentance, and forgiveness. Acknowledging these four as the most commonly used concepts in theologies of reconciliation, Robinson has suggested a model for classifying reconciliation theologies according to emphasis among these four aspects. Robinson identifies two basic types of reconciliation theologies. The first type are reconciliation theologies with liberating tendencies, emphasizing truth and justice, having freedom as their goal. The second type are reconciliation theologies with atoning tendencies, emphasizing repentance and forgiveness, and having peace as their goal. Applied on my material, or the accounts given at TRC meetings, the clear impression is that the great majority of the personal accounts are emphasizing truth and justice, suggesting the liberating discourse people now are engaging in. Seeing these personal stories, narratives as small stories, challenging large narratives is therefore not only justified, but highly relevant, I argue, for an interpretation of what is going on and what is at stake. Framed in the vocabulary of Romero Amaya, these individual stories may be seen as narratives of resistance, challenging dominant national narratives of nationhood and narratives of silence, both historical and contemporary. How the Norwegian TRC will address the problem of dominant historical narratives in light of personal stories received, we do not know for sure. Yet we have a few indications. I must add, no preliminary reports have been given, so we are all waiting for the final report. Yet we have a few indications. One of them is a debate article written by TRC chair Dagfinn Høybråten, entitled "In the Shadow of the Norwegianization Policy." Here he makes it clear that the knowledge now available, quote, necessitates a rewriting of parts of the history of Norway. He also says, considering the contemporary dimensions of this, that, quote, the Norwegianization did not end in the 1960s. The consequences are borne by new generations in new ways. The Commission's mandate runs until today, and then we must get the facts on the table when language or culture is put under severe pressure, even in the present day, end quote. So small stories are challenging large narratives. Ologito. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Tore. I noticed your reference to John Clausen, the hole in the fence. And being a reindeer herder, I know and I have experienced that even a small hole in a fence has the potential to make the whole herd push themselves out of that fence. So maybe that could be a metaphor or an image that we can bring along to the coffee break. And we will be back here at 11:20.
Just a little, because VST needs this space from noon till about 2. So we're gonna have coffee downstairs, and then we're gonna migrate up to the VST building, room 110, which is on the ground floor. And then we'll carry on after coffee up there at 11:20. So coffee's downstairs, then we'll walk up to room 110, and we'll have a little bit of couple papers and then lunch, and then we'll be back here after lunch at 2. If that's not clear, I apologize. All right, see you after coffee. Okay, well, we'll get right to it. I don't want to take up the next time. I'm thankful for the opportunity to talk a little bit about. So what I said I talked about is Indigenous Treaty and Reconciliation. I come from the Treaty Nation, the Treaty First Nations. I'm from Treaty 8, which was signed in 1899. Treaty 8, grew up in northern Alberta, but I raised my kids on Treaty 4 territory in Regina, Saskatchewan. I lived for a couple of years. Winnipeg, which is another treaty. Of course, when I got out of BC, there weren't a lot of treaties here. There wasn't always an understanding of treaty. Because the process, this isn't in my paper, but the process that the government of Canada engages in what they call treaty negotiations is nothing like we envision in the treaty nations. Those elements are always there. Deconstruct the government's use of treaty to relocate people, which is one of the reasons in Treaty 8, the Treaty 8 First Nations in Alberta never took specific land as reserves, because they were pretty sure that the government was going to try to claim the parts that they weren't on reserve. And as Arthur Oski, who's Grand Chief of Treaty 8, says, there is no crown land. The whole thing about treaty, I like the language the name used. It is a romantic idea that I have about treaty. I understand that. That's the nature of trying to come up with a shared narrative in Canada to replace some of the large narratives that Corey talked about, some of the large narratives that exist in Canada. I always thought maybe treaty. Part of this, when I was writing my doctorate, my whole thing was, it was an alternative starting place for Indigenous theology. My whole point was just that if you began with Indigenous communal identity, that would be a different starting place than most theology, modern theology begins with. So most modern theology, at least in the Atlantic North, begins with an alienated individual. That's really where it begins. Stemming from many Descartes and reducing everything to a thinking mind primarily. And I just thought if you began with communal identity, that would be different. Then in the process of writing, thinking about communal identity, part of it was that we believed that we were related to the earth. Most of my understanding came just from listening to Indigenous folks. That was a lot of it was in Regina and Treaty 4, talking about their relationship to the land and some of the stuff that continued to go there, continued to happen there with land claims and trying to get back land that was taken. The whole land claims project that was happening in Saskatchewan, that continues to happen. And I just thought about it. I was thinking of a shared narrative, and I thought about maybe treaty could function in that way. But in the ongoing work of, because I do get asked a lot to go and talk, Dr. Logan talks about, you get asked to go and speak in a lot of different places, which I don't know if you're cynical about it. Sometimes I can be a cynic from time to time. I can always tell how burnt out I'm feeling the more cynical. But many in the West still continue not to want to actually change because they just, they want to add a little bit of Indigenous stuff, then they'll be okay. Big change is hard. But inevitably, people ask, what should I do? And like you said, I didn't answer. So I thought I should come up with an answer. So I have an answer these days. And I say, so then part of it was, which reminds me, it's a really terrible story. I was speaking in one place and someone came up to me and said, I feel really guilty. They want me to help them. What should I do? And I said, I could take an offering if that'll help you. They got mad. They got mad. Probably rightly so. I should have said that probably. But I just thought, so here's three kinds of things that we could, categories of things. I said, well, here's some categories of things. You're going to think about categories of things, and they're not that. I kind of thought there were things that we were always trying to do. One was to heal the land. So if you could engage in there's a book called Alliances by Lynn Davies. I think she edited a book called Alliances. It was just a symposium and the papers that were presented there about Indigenous and non-Indigenous alliances that had happened in Canada. And one of them was centered around just a shared project. So if you come with a shared project, both Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities could at least, it could around that. And I thought about, you know, like forest fires, when you're fighting forest fires, at least where I'm from, people don't, it's not whether it's Indigenous or non-Indigenous forest fire. So I just thought, heal the land. But then I also thought part of it too was the finding of the unmarked graves. That's a wound on the land too. And you have to, so if you wound the land, you wound the people. If you wound the people, you wound the land. So then somehow you always have to be thinking about that. Which led to the second thing was, and generational trauma was one of the things that needed to be. And because I trained clergy, that's mostly where I function, but I get to speak in other places too, sometimes with educators. You have to help people. I was using, if you could raise emotional intelligence, another word I heard is emotional literacy. Many people who are clergy aren't very good at it, or they don't know the language or how to talk about it, or how to create a safe place so people can at least begin to talk about some of those. If you could do some of that, that would help, because in where I'm from, those were the things that hang up people. That many of my relatives that because they can't deal with the trauma. You know, that they'll start to progress in their life, but then they just keep getting knocked back down. It's always there, always there. If we can deal with that. And then the third one is I thought if we could, this was mostly because I was thinking about, I was reading a book called The Heavens Are Changing by Susan Nailing. It's about the gospel coming into the Tsimshian people up in the North Coast. And one of the things she says in there that the church pressured, they had this idea that the indigenous church, the Tsimshian, they had received this Christian gospel, but the colonial church wanted them to differentiate between who was part of the church and who was not part of the church in the village. And the Tsimshian refused to do that. They just refused. They weren't going to do that. They weren't going to divide, because there's this sense of belonging that existed that you still see in indigenous communities that isn't about this institutional whatever it is, the church. And I just thought, you know, if we could capture that, some aspect of a vision for unity that was neither tribalism or a new imperialism. I should take, no, not tribalism. Tony Snow corrected me on that. That's not a good choice of words. That's neither sectarianism or imperialism. Because at some point we have to see. So when I listened to the elders and when they told the story, they were always pushing towards, we have to work with these things and we have to come together as relatives. So then those were the three kinds of things. And that last one sort of I thought that we had an opportunity in Canada, the people in Canada had an opportunity to build a unity within this country. And I thought two resources that aren't always realized that it existed from the beginning are as Indigenous identity or in spirituality and the historic treaty process. So then identity and spirituality. So if you listen to Indigenous creation stories, they talk about their relationship with the earth. That was the other thing that seized me. It was sort of part of it was being at the Sacred Assembly in 1995 that Elijah Harper called, and a bunch of us showed up in Ottawa, or actually all we were staying in Ottawa, and we walked across the bridge. We were Palais de Congrès in Gatineau, Quebec, and we had this meeting. There was a couple, 3,000 of us. We were seeking some spiritual solution, and at first, the only unity thing that we were unified is we all hated the federal government. So that's probably not great. That's not a great basis for reconciliation. But when I listen to people's stories and then the ongoing work of ministry, because I was traveling quite a bit from mostly the prairies, so mostly from Thunder Bay to Cranbrook, and I just thought, no matter where, and it didn't matter if we were Christian, identified as Christian or traditional, we all had the sense that we were created. We were where we were because the Creator had put us there. That was this common thing, that we were there because of the Creator. And our creation story told how we came to be there. So then I actually heard it from Andrew Wesley, told me. At the heart of Indigenous spirituality, he said, is your creation story that tells how you're related to the earth. And I thought about how we're related to the earth. And our identity flows from these creation stories handed down by our elders. The elders have local personal knowledge of the land. I understood about that growing up, and that's how you learn to hunt, and your dad takes you, or your mom takes you. My mom and dad both hunt, and they take you and they show you how to read the land and how to understand how it functions. And my dad used to say to us things like, he wanted to go shooting chickens, so I took him out, like partridge, not the neighbor's chickens. Bruce hen. He said, let's go shoot some chickens. I said, okay, and I would try it. I was old. He said, I know this place. There's always partridge there. He said, I was there 3 years ago. We'll go there. And I thought, how can it be? But they were there. They were there. We always went for moose in the same place. To get an idea. And then you get a vision for that. That's understanding of the land. But there was also mythical stories that take in all time and space. I told a little creation story yesterday about. There's variations of it, but somehow there was a big flood and there's no place to be. The animals bring some dirt and that becomes Turtle Island. There's variations among the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Cree, they all have variations. There's other creation stories where they come out of the mountain, Lakota, that they come out of a sacred mountain. They all tell how we came to be where we are. The beauty of the creation stories is that we understand how we came to be on the earth. And then Neil MacLeod writes in a book, he said, and you can stand on the land and feel it welcome you home. And understand that, no matter where I am, I can go outside and I can see the northern lights, and I can the northern lights, and then you can always find the North Star, and then you can say, you feel the land welcome you home. And so then, and then I was thinking about spirituality for at least the plain spirituality. It's a good world. Our ceremonies begin with the idea that it's a good world, that you give thanks. You give thanks. Good world. I just thought that part of this understanding that our creation story is part of our creation story. How our spirituality tells how we're related to the earth. I just thought that Canada needed a different creation story because the one that they had was too small. It was too small because it had some idea that this was an empty land. This one. That happens more in Australia, terra nullius, the idea that the land is empty. But as I understand in British Columbia, that the provincial government in British Columbia early on used that idea significantly to say that this land was empty and they were trying to claim it. At one point, they actually tried to claim the land and say it's provincial land, not crown land. They tried to pass a law in the 1920s or something, which is ruled unconstitutional. But BC only gives 15 acres per family when they're making reserves, whereas it has been reduced by the time it gets to Alberta, it's only 160 acres per family. In Manitoba, it's 360 or 320 acres per family. But BC just really, and their rationale is because it's an empty land. So then that creation story doesn't work for Canada. The other one in my, I don't know if I'd use it in paper, but I just, when I'm speaking, I think it's funny. I thought it was funny because there was this little vignette that was playing at the beginning of movies when we were going to movies before COVID. They played this little vignette because they found Franklin was an expedition. He got lost and died. And they'd show this little vignette where they said, we found the ruins of his ships and things. We're a nation of explorers. And I thought, yeah, he'll get lost and die. That's not much of a story. Better story than that. But I just thought that in terms of spirituality and law, they all flow from this. They flow from the indigenous. I was thinking about that. I really thought about it when I ventured up into the land of the Nisga'a territory. They talked about the law coming from their creation story. And then if you check out John Borrow's writing, that somehow the land, the creation story, the spirituality and the law comes from that. So my idea was that if we had a different creation story, and I just barely touch on it, that was one of my examining committees said that would be an area for further study. I just thought that the Indigenous treaty process, particularly by the time it reached the numbered treaties of the prairies, that was an attempt at a shared narrative. Because it wasn't a contract per se. It was coming into a relationship with the newcomers. And Jackie Ottman's master's thesis. Jackie Ottman is now the president of First Nations University in Saskatchewan. Reading her master's thesis because she did it on the spirituality in the elders from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in the RCAP documented those meetings. In Saskatchewan, particularly among the Dakota, they viewed the treaty process as a making relative ceremony. Making relative ceremony, you can read about it. It was made famous in, someone wrote about the making relative ceremony as told to them from Black Elk among the Lakota. But in it, you rehearse some of the tensions that exist between the people. And then you come together and you become relatives with the understanding that you're making a peace. And then you burn sweetgrass and you become like relatives. For many in Treaty 4 and in Saskatchewan, when we made treaty, we were making a covenant with the newcomers. And they understood that. If you read the journals of Morris Henry Morris, who was the treaty commissioner. He, thankfully, he wrote down everything that everybody said, or a translation of it, and they understood it that they were making a covenant that was going to last for all time. And so in the braid of sweetgrass, one braid represents First Nations. One strand of the braid represents the newcomers, and one strand represents the Creator, who would hold us to this commitment to live like relatives. That was the understanding of the treaty, and that you would renew that treaty every year. That's the part that I think it's a shared narrative. It's not just, there's a book out called From Treaty People to Treaty Nation. That could be Canada's creation story that tells how it's related to the earth. How Canada exists on the positive side because of the goodwill of Indigenous people who made treaties with the newcomers. And I think that that provides a basis for going forward that tells how people could have a relationship with the land. The romantic part of my idea is that in relationship with Indigenous people, then newcomers would have kind of an Indigenous identity through that relationship because they have a creation story that tells how they're related to the earth. I just thought that would be a better narrative than a country of explorers get lost and die. Thanks a lot. I'm going to stop there so that we don't get further off track. Where did I stop? No, good. Let me get you.
Right.
Yeah.
I lived along my adult like 126, and they would always invoke the romantic phrase, you know, as long as the wind blows, the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines. That is actually built into the dialogue, which is
Yes. Yes, and if you check out Morris's journal, he might have been the one that said that.
and it is an eternity, right? And it is all rooted in.
He actually contrasts it with what the Americans were doing. Like Henry Morris said, we're not doing here what the Americans did, but we're becoming one, and that will last for all time. That was the Indigenous treaty process. There's a little essay you can get, Compact Contract Covenant by J.R. Miller. He might have wrote a whole book about it, but there's actually, it's an essay, which I always tell my students, if you find an essay that tell you what's in the book, that's
Contract and
covenant. All right, so John Clausen is gonna zoom in, yes? Yes. And from South Africa, who wants to introduce John? John, you'll have to introduce yourself. Can you highlight him up on the screen?
I don't know.
Well, I met John when we were in Norway, and I like what he has to say about story, and I think he's going to say some more about it.
Connectivity. Hello, can you hear us?
Are we going to be able to hear?
Okay, can you hear me, everybody? Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So with us here, it is a good evening. I think with you, it's good afternoon, just about. I'm John Claassen, and I apologize for the way in which you see me on the screen, but in South Africa, we have load shedding. So I'm depending on a very small light for you at least to see my face. And yes, I'm John Claassen from the University of the Western Cape. I'm a practical theologian. So I'll be talking or sharing some ideas around some theological ideas around narrative. And I actually want to thank Ray for introducing the creation narrative and especially towards the end of his presentation, where he suggests actually a kind of narrative with these three prongs or three parts. So let me get straight into my presentation. And I'll share the screen and hopefully you can see that. So what I would like to do is a very brief presentation around the question of narrative as the interlocutor or the thing that connects the people and reconciliation. In the first part of the presentation, I just want to refresh maybe your memory. These are things that you will know, some points, but just to perhaps share with you some ideas of how religion is defined, and hopefully later on in the presentation, it will become clear why I do this. So in the sociologists of religion speak about religion in two ways. First, we are told that religion is about what we call substantive matters, so sort of the core things that make up a religion, and these are usually things like the divine being or a reference to God, faith statements, creeds, sort of summaries of a belief, worldview. So, what does this phenomena, this religion represent in terms of the way we interpret humanity and the world and so forth. And then we have things like worship and so on. And then the second interpretation or description that they give for, this is now sociologists of religion, is that we are told that religion also has to do with the function that it performs. Sort of what is the aim of religion? In theological terms, one can also, or missiological terms, one can probably ask, so what is the mission? What is God's mission? What is the mission of humanity? And what does this phenomena called religion wants to achieve? One can look at the famous Max Weber's Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, how religion contributes to capitalism, for example. What hopefully would be of interest to you, and certainly for us in South Africa, is the sort of the African perspectives of religion, where it is quite different from the Western understanding, in that religion here is certainly the interconnection of both the spiritual and the material world. So within African perspective and the context, there's no difference between what is visible and what is invisible, what is spiritual and what is material. There's certainly an overlap and integration and interlink between the two. For example, we find within the African traditional religion that, for example, we do not speak of the dead in a sense of insignificant, but rather we speak, for example, of the death from a religious perspective as actually living within one's memory. The dead is also seen as the living dead. So there is a sense in which, the dead is still with us through ancestry and other means. Within Catholicism, of course, one can make reference to saints, that still has a life after after the material body is gone. But there's a new kind of interpretation of religion that is now taking, I think, certainly religion and theological studies by storm. And that is what we call lived religion. And lived religion is actually, it's very interesting because it actually refers to how belief systems are embodied in a person or persons or a community. So it is all about expressions, in both actions, in behavior and being, and not just about abstract beliefs or concepts about things, but how do I live this out? One thing in all these expressions, there is one thing is for sure, that the significance of religion is that it has ideas or guidelines about what a good society might be, or what a right order of a society might be. One can also refer to it maybe in more contemporary terms as social justice. It even tells us about ideas about what a family should be, gender relations, and certainly ways to achieve or maintain this good society. So for me, at the core of a good society is reconciliation between God and the created order, and amongst all God's creatures. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make, I just want to share one or two thoughts about, how I perceive Christian anthropology. In other words, from a Christian perspective, how do we perceive human beings? Now, the Imago Dei, which for centuries serves as the doctrinal formulation of the meaning of what it means to be human, can be analyzed against the background of three possible formulations. So, as you know, the doctrine of of human beings, or of what it means to be human, or of anthropology, there are three possible interpretations for this doctrine, and I would think, sort of other doctrines as well. And the first one is that we can think of a doctrine as something that is fixed, So when we think of the Imago Dei, we can think of, and certainly one can think of it perhaps from a Western perspective, as, anybody who can is a human being, and that is it. All right, and that should be applied universally, irrespective of where one finds yourself and your culture and so forth. But secondly, and in almost contrast to this classicist view or this first view that I mentioned, one can say that the doctrine can be replaced by more contextual notions of what it means to be human. So is there a need for us to understand ourselves through the eyes or through the lenses of more contemporary understandings of what it means to be human? That would probably make, a lot of and here I talk about the Christian religion, a lot of the Christian doctrines, sort of no significance. But there's a third way of thinking of these doctrines, and especially this doctrine, that there is certainly a development. So there's a continuation of this These three notions of the doctrine of Imago Dei, I won't in detail discuss now, but certainly it needs to be analyzed for a constructive development of this Imago Dei.
Go restate the third one.
Can I just, yes?
Please, the last part. The third. It froze on number 3.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. Thank you so much. So the third one, the third notion of this doctrine could be interpreted as a living belief or a living system.
Sorry, brother, we can't hear you. One more time. So it was a living system?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Now we can.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So let me go to the next slide. I'm so worried. So let me just. I'm going to try and go a bit faster. I think it's probably our electricity problem here. So let me then say. So what I did in my research is to look at this whole notion of personhood to understand what we as human beings are. And there are a number of points I would like to make here. I would like to suggest that when we think about what it means to be a human being from a Christian perspective, that we start thinking about the uniqueness of what it means to be human in relation to the uniqueness of creation. And I think, Ray, I here latch onto your contribution that you make about the relationship between land and you, how you feel comfortable and, sort of in one with the land and so forth. And so the first thing, I discovered, if one reads Genesis 1, verse 26 up to 28, there is something in there that states us that we as human beings are in fact not the pinnacle of God's creation. That in fact, the rest of God's creation is as unique as we are. Let me just go to the next point. And the second thing that I'm investigating is there a different way of looking at our identity from the perspective of the creation story? And I find in the Hebrew word shelem, certainly makes the point that actually our identity is also about our body, our visibility, that which we see is also part of the image of God. And then thirdly, I go to Genesis 5.3 and I see, when we look at the interpretation of this Imago Dei, or being created in the image of God, that certainly within the Near Eastern society, the context of being created in God's likeness is because of this hierarchical society that existed at the time, this class division at the time. And so God creates us, both as a being, so being created in God's image, but also coupled with a call to against such hierarchical divisions, against divisions, as them and us and so forth. Let me make one more point here. I'm just worried that I'm going to lose you or you will lose me. A final point on this personhood, the importance of this concept is that using a post-colonial feminist approach, the author Daggers managed to connect the question of vocation or our calling with eschatology, sort of with a future as the present. And in doing that, she successfully claims that the personal or collective responsibility is one condition of us being made in God's image. That it's actually part of who we are, part of our vocation to you know, to be called as in the image of God. Now, in all of this, let me just summarize in saying what this teaches me. And here I come to the creation narrative, you know, is about being an active agent, because it's certainly it is about my being, my body, but also about my doing. So I'm actually created, you know, in this visible being that one can see, but also in what I'm called to do. And in a sense, we are called against hierarchy, against the absolute uniqueness of certain groups of people over others, certain individuals over others. It teaches me about one's personal responsibility, our own call to partake in breaking down these kind of binaries and these kind of divisions. It also teaches me that as an individual, or my anthropological story, in other words, my being who I am, is part of a landscape of other stories. And it's only when I connect with other stories, or as Ray, if I understood you correctly, Ray, this new creative story, it's only when one is able to do that that we give meaning to our lives. So this narrative also has to do with the land, because God gives us, you know, this kind of a special relationship with the land and with space and with God's resources. Now, in all of this, I think the end is to be reconciled with God and all creation. So finally, I come back to those three formulations of what it means to be created in God's image. And I argue that the reformulation of this doctrine within the context calls us as Christian anthropology that there is a development of this doctrine within our contemporary world of binaries, such as the colonizer and the colonized, or one can say the colonialism versus authentic indigenous people, constructed nation, or as Ray calls it, ones that would come after the original subjects. I think it's a call against a black and white division, but to bring people together. Let me stop there and thank you for listening. And I certainly hope that you were able to follow. And I give over to Ray, or to the chairperson. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that.
The absence of John. Oh, there we're back. Right, yeah.
We turn it over to you.
All right.
Oh, well, it says we get a 10-minute break now. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back with one more paper, and Lena will introduce the next paper. Yes, so we'll take a short break. We don't have time to get a coffee. Stretching legs. I had to go.
So I have a lot to learn. So in addition to what I'm going to say about rewritings and so, I will share my experience from what I've learned here in Canada so far. Of course, it will grow afterwards. Thank you, Ray, for having me here, and also my apologies for being a bit late to this session. As clear as you was, there was one less smart person in the church, me, wondering where the group. Luckily for me, a student of yours followed me the whole way here. So thank you for that. And thank you to Tore for inviting the project. Yes, as you see, that the headline is a little bit changed. And this headline was actually handed to me a couple of weeks ago for something else I should do a presentation about, and I thought it was so good. So I brought it with me to share with you. Transforming injustices, reconciliation with ourselves. It made me think a lot, and I think that the inner or the internal or the inner reconciliation is what we are handling the most at the Southern University of Applied Science. We have students from all the 4 countries, because Sápmi stretches over 4 countries. So we have Sami students from all of the Sami areas. So it's much about rewriting history and knowledge building. And we get back to that. And I chose this picture because it's taken just outside my workplace and also the village or whatever that I live in. And you can see here the Sami lavo, or the skeleton of the Sami lavo, traditional. So our students get this ready every fall when we start our studies again, and we sometimes sit there. And in this particular context, it might also I might also my English is not my first language. I also want to tell that the new Bible translation in Northern Sami language was actually placed in this lavo. This lavo is filled when the new Bible arrived, and we placed the new Bible in the secret place in the back of the lavo. So hoping that it will be a blessing to our communities and our people. I also show this picture because I like how the sun unfolds on this picture. This is how the sun looks when it's really, really cold. Of course, now you sit in a house, it's not a danger to you, but I guess in previous times, it really showed how powerful the sun is. It gives life, but it is also a power. And it's called Aitalasta in Sami, that the sun, that is what the sun does when it does like this. And it's also a symbol of time and many other things, and also the symbol of our school. So everything is mirrored in the creation. The creation mirrors us, and we mirror the creation. As Ray talked about creation, I was so happy because it's very related to the work I have been doing. So maybe I can also mention that my doctoral thesis was about blessing practices, which is actually about communication with creation. So I start this with saying Archibaldni Basseboina Nammi, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So that is a blessing that we usually have. And thank you, Iman, for having my PowerPoint and for having full control. So now I say it next. Can I have the next picture? So, rewriting history, what might it mean in Sami settings? So I heard about braiding sweetgrass. I have also read the book that has the same name. But in order to have the stories like interlinked, all the stories have to first be kind of verbalized or written down. For me, as a researcher, I would hope that the truth and reconciliation process will lead to more funding for writing the Sami history. As an example, I can tell that my students coming all the way from Sápmi, they know almost all of them the name of Norwegian and Swedish and Finnish missionaries. But I do not know the name of the first Sami priest from the late 1600s. And that tells me something about the situation in school. So when they fund research for writing the church history, it's mostly about the church and what they did to us, but what about us? I would like all the children to know the names of the Sami priests and the preachers, and of course also of the Noigi and the Gopla and the healers and the other religious experts. But this story is not yet written. It's in between the lines, and you can't hand students like this research paper that is very, specific and detailed. We need a broad history to be written. So this is from Sami artist. She's do broderie. Her name is Britta Markat Lappa, and she has brodered the Sami history for several meters. Britta Markat Lappa, she is actually famous internationally. And there is also a way of telling one's own story. The other topic that I thought I have been thinking about is knowledge and transmission of knowledge between generations. As Ray mentioned, in hunting and fishing, if your grounds are taken away from you, or if there is windmills or whatever, you cannot practice that. And with that comes also language and knowledge and a lot of things. And I have been reminded yesterday about what can you do? Everybody of you mentioned that. So I was thinking, what can I do? Well, I work at a Sami institution. I meet a lot of Sami youth. This is where I can contribute to this larger narrative. Yes, please. It's not just in the church that we need to decolonize. It's also in academical studies. So the Sami society is very studied. It has been a lot of research done. But the problem is often that researchers, they have their own frames and their own categories that are not based in Sami language and Sami worldview. So when it comes back, if it ever comes back, it's kind of framed in a way like, yeah, but no. but it's only the elders that have the knowledge to be critical. So after heavy assimilation politics and the knowledge is fragmented. So how can a young person searching for his Sami identity know what is, what is our knowledge and what is not? How to be critical about that. So I think that education is very important, and also to really build up our own educational institutions. I think that is very, very important. So in a way, when you are reading historical texts, you often get caught in this, but you get unsure, what is this tradition or not? So how to make it not alien? Also, if this becomes very alien, you also have this feeling of loss. But if you put it in another frame, you will see that, well, we have a lot left. We actually have stories. We have practices. We have, instead of saying the research frames are a bit wrong, we often say, well, we lost it. But maybe that is not always true. Maybe it is because it's framed in an alien way that we do not recognize it as ours. Yes. I'm not talking too long. So one is research and research history and reframing, and make sure that Sami youth and everybody else knows their own when we tell about it. And the second one is all this knowledge that has been transmitted and transferred through generation in stories, in practices, and when the everyday life is rapidly changing, we have to transform that knowledge somehow, or gather we have to do it in another way because the everyday life has changed. So because I had read that braiding sweetgrass, I thought we have another grass, and it's shoe hay that you put in your shoes to keep them warm and comfortable. It's not that people don't use other shoes now, but I can say in the winter time, this fur one, Skaftmagat, is by far the warmest. So people are still doing this, and also in the schools and the kindergartens and so forth. And it is also, when you do it, you should always ask for permission and also bless when you do it, because they are also quite sharp. And you know that you need it to keep your foot warm. And I think the ethics in that is also that nothing is too small for you to ask for permission. Because you know that you are a human being. You know that you are the only one that can destroy for all the other creations. And only you have that in you, that destructive force. And therefore you should submit to all other creation in creation. And always remind yourself of that humbleness. And I have also been thinking about, okay, but I am an academic. So how does this apply to my work? And I try to start everything I do with blessing. And I try to kind of transform it when I talk to my students. And I think these are also processes that need to be ongoing on the same time as the truth and reconciliation processes. The internal knowledge building and to build robust or safe future generations. I usually say you should stand like an older lady. Older Sami lady, they stand like this. And they have a belt and they have this gapit. And so when you talk and you are young, you should stand like this. If you're not confident before, you will get the and this is just a picture of my daughter. So now when we talk about climate change and everything, we hear a lot about not eating meat, but in Sami world, you are allowed to take as much as you need, but you should not take more. In a way, this shows a woman who is my dear friend, older than me, and my daughter. And I hope it pictures some kind of knowledge transmitting, but I also would like to lift that aspect. How do we solve it in the new world? How do we build these arenas for knowledge in a new everyday life? And then we have the church as an institution. This is a rebuilt chapel from the 18th century. It was reconsecrated, that's the right word. This weekend, actually. The bishop has reinvented it. This is some of my students last winter, and we went to see this chapel. It was not to Christianize the Sami people, it was to claim land. Because about 50 or 60 kilometers away from this chapel, the Swedish crown had built their chapel and said that this is ours. The people who were there before it didn't matter. So this is our grounds, and then the Danish Norwegian king, because it was a union back then, and Thomas von Westen, who was a Norwegian missionary, they said, yeah, let's build this chapel. As you see, it's very small. The thought is not that people are going to use this. And then the story of this place actually is that this is also a cemetery, has been later on, and it was also threatened about with this large water, vattenkraftverk. Dam. Dam. So it was threatened to flood all this area. So it was stopped in the last minute. As you saw by Fristaveld Malifellata, it's from that event, the first picture. So it was stopped in last. So this has been colonized in different ways throughout the history, and that is the history of many places in Sami area. And in this project, there has already been a book outhanded, and I wrote a chapter together with my colleague, that is not here today, about the Truth and Reconciliation project as a national project when Sápmi stretches over 4 countries. It's only Norway that are now close to finish their process. Finland has started, and Sweden, but many of the stories that need to be reconciled is about the borders, how they have split families, migration routes, the wounds of these enforced relocations. I don't know how can we get there through national truth and reconciliation commissions. But that is an open question. I really hope that the Norwegian Commission will take this into account when presenting the results, that they have cut the stories vertical when our borders are horizontal. Yeah, and as you see, there is also a lot of snow. Now to think about. Yeah, so these are my two kind of main that I think that Sami institutions should kind of cope with now when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission comes with their report. We have to build the knowledge to our own youth, to our own society, and we also have to connect again with creation. And now you can, yeah, I just have to remember what no, the picture fell out. Then you can take back again. I will just say it. So I had a picture about creation and how it mirrors itself. The sky reflects in the water, and we reflect creation back again. So I also think that we have to restore some sort of belonging to places, but also to other creation. As you mentioned yesterday, the little hummingbird. And I have been in Vancouver since Friday, and I have been following how animals adapt in the city environment, because that was my own project when doing this trip. So the hummingbird is the last one. But I think it's really fascinating how birds and animals like squirrels, but also in Stanley Park, there is this coyote. Yeah, I thought I was so stupid, it's easy to dog. I didn't know what it was. And how they adapt to us, even though we just take, we do not care about the biodiversity or anything. And I trust in that the creation will live without us, but we cannot live without creation. And there are some fundamental relations to be restored, and that knowledge is in indigenous societies. And sometimes people say, yeah, but that's ideas. Yeah, but we need to have ideas. Otherwise, we don't know where we are going. We get lost. We have to strive for something. And one other thing I learned here in Vancouver is I want to be as patient as you are. I was very touched by to remember that you are a human being always, no matter what has happened. And when people turn their back at you and then come back, you should greet them. That really touched me. And in Sami, we have this saying that, more experienced people can say to you, don't stand there like a stallo. And the stallo is this figure in storytelling that is very big and likes gold and eats children, even his own children. And he has this wife that is called Luther, that she is just as bad. So when you are not like friendly, when you are not open, or when you are not a giving person, you can get that as a, don't just stand there as a stallo. So I think that was very connected to the teachings from you. So I will wrap this up with a Sami proverb that says that a hand that gives never turns empty. So we should not think about giving as then I don't have anything left, but a giving hand is never empty. And we also say thank you for my share, Kiitos Muosi Outa. So that wraps up my talk today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louisa. And I noticed this what you said, to both build knowledge and to connect again in creation, and that those two are really going so closely together, much together. There is now lunchtime, and after lunch we meet back in the chapel, right?
Claro.
1 o'clock.
Yes.